and Grandpa were wonderful farmers. They grew lots of vegetables on their farm. And all of the people who lived nearby, they really liked Grandma and Grandpa because they knew Grandma and Grandpa were very important people. And this is why. They grew more vegetables than they could eat. They grew more vegetables than they could sell at the market. And whenever they had extra, they would always give it away to the people who lived nearby. So everybody paid attention to Grandma and Grandpa. One day Grandpa got up and said, "I'd like to plant something different." And so he went over to one part of the farm there, and he dug a hole, and he planted a turnip bulb into the hole. He covered it over and he stomped it down, and then, because Grandpa was a very good farmer, and all good farmers know that every living thing needs attention, and that whatever you pay attention to in life is what grows, he decided to pay attention to that turnip. He looked down at that turnip and he said, "Turnip, grow sweet and juicy." And that turnip started to grow. And it grew and it grew because every day in the morning, first thing, Grandpa would come over to that turnip and say, "Turnip, grow sweet and juicy." And it grew until it was sticking way up out of the ground. Well, one day, Grandma came walking by after Grandpa had already visited the turnip. She didn't know anything about the turnip, but she saw immediately what it was. She looked down, she said, "Oh, a turnip!" And she took her watering can and she watered the turnip. And because Grandma too was a very good farmer and knew that every living thing needed attention and that whatever you pay attention to in life is what grows, she decided to pay attention to that turnip. She watered it every day, and after that also she talked to it. She said, "Turnip, grow big and strong." And that turnip grew sweet and juicy and big and strong. Now Grandpa didn't know that Grandma knew about the turnip. Grandma didn't know that Grandpa knew about the turnip. But Grandpa was very pleased with the turnip. He looked out at it one day and said to himself, "I'd better get that turnip out of the ground before the field mice get it." So he walked out and he grabbed onto the stem of that turnip and he tried to pull that turnip out of the ground. And he pulled and he pulled and he pulled, but that turnip wouldn't come out of the ground because it was a stubborn turnip. Just then Grandma came walking up. She said, "Grandpa, what are you doing with my turnip?" Grandpa said, "What do you mean your turnip?" Grandma said, "I water that turnip every day." Grandpa said, "Well, I talk to it every day." Grandma said, "I talk to it too." Grandpa said, "Well, I planted it." Well, as you can see, Grandma and Grandpa were having an argument. Now, when you have an argument, when you get really mad, the first thing that happens is your face gets really ugly. Next time that happens, next time you get angry, look in the mirror. It's kind of funny looking. Well, Grandma and Grandpa's faces got really ugly. And then, next thing after that happens instantly is the anger part of your brain quits working. Now, wait a minute. It's not the anger part. It's the thinking part of your brain that quits working. It's the anger part of your brain that takes over and says, "I'm in charge here." And then, then that's what happened with Grandma and Grandpa. They both got so angry they wouldn't talk to each other. They turned their backs on each other. And they didn't talk to each other the rest of the day. They didn't talk to each other the next day either. Or the next day. Soon the people who lived nearby started to get worried. What's going on with Grandma and Grandpa? They're not paying attention to anything. Are we going to get any vegetables this year? Is this our fault? What are we going to do? Just like when you get mad, your friends and family, they worry about you too. Well, after several days had gone by, Grandpa got up in the morning, he looked in the mirror, and his face was better looking. His brain had started to work again too. He said all this fighting is not getting the turnip out of the ground. So he came out to get the turnip out of the ground. Meanwhile, Grandma woke up the same morning, and her face was better looking, and her brain was working, and she had an idea. She came walking out, she said, "Grandpa, I have an idea. Why don't we pull up our turnip?" Grandpa heard a good idea. He said, "Yes, Grandma, let's work together." So Grandpa grabbed the turnip. Grandma grabbed Grandpa. And they pulled, and they puffed, and they puffed, and they pulled, and still the turnip wouldn't come up because it was a stubborn turnip. Grandpa said, "This is a stubborn turnip. I've got an idea. Why don't we sing to the turnip to soften it up?" And so they sang to it. This is what they sang. "Turnip, turnip, come on up. Turnip, turnip, come on up." And then Grandpa grabbed the turnip, Grandma grabbed Grandpa, and they pulled and they puffed and they puffed and they pulled, and still the turnip wouldn't come up because it was a stubborn turnip. So then they decided to call for some help. They decided to call on their grandson Ivan. Now, grandson Ivan was 16 years old, and 16-year-olds like to do two things more than anything else. They like to eat and they like to sleep. I know, I've lived with 16-year-olds. That's what they do. So Ivan he'd already eaten that day. He was sleeping. So they called to Ivan, "Ivan, wake up!" Only Ivan didn't wake up. They had to call again, "Ivan, wake up!" Finally, Ivan woke up. He stretched and yawned and said, "What do you want?" Grandma said, "Help us." Ivan looked. Grandma and Grandpa were working together. Oh my, even Ivan knew about the fight, and now Grandma and Grandpa are working together. He said, "I'd better help." He got up and he helped. And Grandpa said, "First we have to sing, turnip, turnip, come on up. Turnip, turnip, come on up." Then Grandpa grabbed the turnip, Grandma grabbed Grandpa, Ivan grabbed Grandma, and they pulled and they puffed and they puffed and they pulled, and still the turnip wouldn't come up because it was a stubborn turnip. So they decided to call on their puppy dog. The puppy dog's name was Spot. They called Spot. "Spot!" Spot came running up. "What can I do? What can I do? What can I do?" They said, "Oh, help us, Spot." Well, Spot was a very dependable and helpful dog. Spot grabbed onto the end of the line. Grandpa said, "First we have to sing, turnip, turnip, come on up. Turnip, turnip, come on up." Then Grandpa grabbed the turnip, Grandma grabbed Grandpa, Ivan grabbed Grandma, and Spot grabbed Ivan, and they pulled and they puffed and they puffed and they pulled, and still the turnip wouldn't come up because it was a stubborn turnip. So they decided to call on their cat. The cat's name was Sasha. They called Sasha, "Sasha!" Now Sasha was a very mature cat, and all mature cats know that people are boring. So when they called, Sasha said, "Why are they doing that?" So they had to call again, "Sasha!" Sasha said, "I wish they'd quit doing that." They had to call again, "Sasha!" Finally, Sasha came walking up and said, "What do you want?" Grandma said, "Help us." Well, Sasha knew about the fight, and there's Grandma and Grandpa working together. Grandson Ivan, he's usually sleeping and he's helping, and that silly dog Spot was trying to show her up by being more helpful. Sasha knew she'd better help. So she got to the end of the line. Grandpa said, "First we have to sing, turnip, turnip, come on up. Turnip, turnip, come on up." Then Grandpa grabbed the turnip, Grandma grabbed Grandpa, Ivan grabbed Grandma, Spot grabbed Ivan, and Sasha grabbed Spot, and they pulled and they puffed and they puffed and they pulled, and still the turnip wouldn't come up because it was a stubborn turnip. They were ready to give up. They were ready to go back into the house when just then the hero of our story came hopping by. A tiny little field mouse. The field mouse stopped and saw what was going on. And the first thing the field mouse saw was an enormous turnip. The field mouse went, "Yum." And then the field mouse saw, well, Grandma and Grandpa are working together. Even the field mice had heard about the fight. And then there's grandson Ivan helping. He's usually sleeping. The dog and the cat are usually chasing each other. Everybody's helping. The field mouse looked at all of this cooperation and said the most important thing of the whole story. The field mouse said, "I've got to be a part of this." And so the field mouse ran over to help. Grandpa said, "One more time, turnip, turnip, come on up. Turnip, turnip, come on up." Then Grandpa grabbed the turnip, Grandma grabbed Grandpa, Ivan grabbed Grandma, Spot grabbed Ivan, and Sasha grabbed Spot, and then the field mouse grabbed onto the end, and they pulled, and they puffed, and whoa! The turnip came up out of the ground. And it was the sweetest and juiciest turnip anybody had ever seen. Why, they took that turnip into the house, and they made turnip stew. They had so much turnip stew to eat. Oh, my goodness. They ate it for a month. After that month, Grandma turned to Grandpa and said, "Next year, don't plant a turnip."